Hello there, I'm Dr. Karen Janes, psychologist and energy healer in the UK, and welcome to the Life Made Easier podcast, where you'll find ancient wisdom with a modern approach. In each episode, we're going to be sharing tips from the world of energy healing to help you develop and enhance your energy intelligence and to make your life easier in simple and practical ways.
And I'm Dr. Tiffany Hunter, energy healer in the United States. In today's episode, we're exploring the elements, what it means to be made up of different combination of the natural elements of earth, fire, air, and water, how that understanding can be used to increase our self-knowledge, ease our relationships, and expand our familiar experience to include the energetic world.
So we should probably start with what do we mean by the elements before we go any further. And really, when we're talking about the elements of something, we're breaking it down into its base components. So what are the characteristics that we can use to describe something? So in this, for this podcast, we're thinking about the elements of earth, water, fire, and air. And I mean, I just want to add in here to avoid any confusion. This doesn't literally mean that one person, has more fire inside of them or more earth inside of them. It's more of a kind of conceptual or theoretical concept model to group together some different characteristics that is really drawn from the natural world and how we see things, kind of the balance of nature and how that works, and then applying that to people as a way to help us understand more about ourselves. And I think perhaps a good way of thinking about this is, to enjoy a piece of cake, you don't necessarily need to know what the individual ingredients are. But if you want to know which cake to choose, are you a chocolate person or a vanilla person or a lemon person? It's helpful to know something about the ingredients, which then will guide you and hopefully help you not be, disappointed in your cake choices. And choose something that's going to work for you. And then if you really wanted to dig in more, you might need to understand more about those ingredients. But basically, that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. What kinds of things is it helpful to know about how we can conceptualize ourselves as humans using this sort of system of thinking about earth, air, fire, and water?
It would be very disappointing indeed to get into a chocolate cake when you've been expecting lemon or vice versa. That I wouldn't like that. I wouldn't like that at all. So the way that we're using this understanding of the world, it's really a way that you can hold up a mirror to yourself and to the people around you and understand some of your own reactions to things and how you might be responding. And even perhaps more importantly, how other people are responding, how you might approach them differently because of what their makeup is, and how you can understand more about what you need for yourself because of your makeup. And I will say that I know there's people out there that are probably interested in astrology and what their astrological sign is, whether they're an earth sign or a fire sign. And it's our experience that may or may not be the case, that your astrological sign matches the personality characteristics that we're talking about. They don't always go together. So if you've identified strongly with your astrological sign, that's great. But if you've always felt like, that doesn't really describe me, this may work for you better. So we're going to define each of the four and talk about them in turn. And we're actually going to start with Earth because it's the most dense and the most tangible, and we had to start somewhere. So we thought it would be fun to start there. We're always up for fun. And we'll talk a little bit about how each one feels like, how they respond to things, how they make choices about things, and what they look like when they're balanced and they're unbalanced, right? And we'll be referring a lot to the natural, the nature characteristics that match each one. So earthy people tend to be slow-moving creatures. They tend to be still and deep, tend to be nurturing, calm, stable, and very reflective. And those would be adjectives that I would use for someone who is a naturally balanced earth, who is a natural earth element person who is balanced, right? Stable, calm. They tend to feel very when you're around an earth person, you can tend to feel safe, tend to feel taken care of. When they may not speak often or quickly, but when they do, there's clearly a depth and time that has spent in their reflection of what's going to come out of their mouth next. They're not just speaking off the cuff or spontaneous. Earth elements, when they're unbalanced, tend to be heavy and ponderous, right? That deep reflection becomes ponderous and becomes procrastination and stodginess. Instead of feeling calm and stabilizing, they feel heavy and burdened. And instead of feeling safe around them, you might feel like you're being weighed down by them and their ponderousness. And these things can come up in how they respond to things and in their behavior. So, for example, I described a balanced earth person who doesn't speak often, but when they do, has a very clearly thought through response to something, versus an unbalanced earth person, for when they speak to something, if they've been heavy and ponderous, might be hard to follow their thought because it may be so weighed down, or it may be so overly focused and overly micromanaging of something that they've gotten into the weeds and into the details, and there's no lifting, there's no ability to move. It's all being ground to a halt because of their unbalancedness.
I think it's worth kind of saying here that when we're talking about these four different categories, most people aren't going to be 100% one. Many people will be a bit of a combination of two or maybe three. But you may well see aspects of yourself or people you know in each of these. And one of my reasons for saying this is that often what Tiffany and I do before we come to a podcast topic is we'll have a bit of a chat about it. And we've realized that there's loads of things in these podcasts that we've never really, although we do similar work and we've done a lot of training together, we've never really sat down and kind of really talked through and made sure we have a shared language and or even checked each other's ideas about things. And when we were talking a bit about this topic and really making sure we could clearly sort of define these four different elements, it was kind of hilarious because I realized that I am actually far more watery than I had always thought myself to be. I had always thought that I was very predominantly an earthy person. And then when we really started defining it, we were both a bit like, you're not really like that. It kind of, so I think, and probably when we're out of balance, we could end up looking a bit more like one of the other elements maybe as well sometimes. So it seems I am actually more watery than I had thought. So I'm going to do my best to define a bit and let you know a bit about what a watery person is like. So if we think about the element of water in the natural world, I mean, water is essential to all life. And you can, if you think about all different kinds of bodies of water, so we might have a beautiful, gentle, flowing stream or a raging, tempestuous sea. A lake could be very still, a very still, calm surface of water that's not really moving very much at all. Or, water can have the power to move boulders, big rocks, to wear away, erode, coastline, something that's being talked about quite a lot these days. So water can be quite different in its energy. And so a person, if we're transferring that to people, a person who is watery is likely to be, a pretty fluid kind of person, probably quite adaptable, flexible, someone who's fairly comfortable with change, can just, go with, adapt to whatever's happening. Watery people often have, something of a lightness to them. I think some of these things will become clearer when we're talking about comparisons, because airy people also can be quite light. But I think there's someone who's more watery is probably a lighter type of person than someone who's earthy, who will have more depth. and there's often a sense of movement. But when out of balance, watery people can be very timid and weak. They might be the kind of person that you think of, oh, that's a really weak, sort of sappy, kind of ineffectual sort of person. I'm now imagining like that horrible limp handshake kind of thing. And again, whilst in balance, they might be very adaptable and really easy to be around because they'll just go with the flow and, oh, what are we doing now? Okay, yeah, that's great, but they could also be quite insipid or irritating, which I'm sure that none of those things apply to me, even though I am apparently more watery than I thought. And, might have trouble making decisions. The kind of adaptability becomes I can't decide. It could be a bit non-committal. It could be hard to get them to focus on something or really you sort of commit to something because they're kind of just, moving away. I think that would be my summary, which is hopefully balanced, even though it's I delved a bit into the more personal stuff there. So Tiffany, tell us about fire.
I was gonna say, even though you're still getting over your shock at being more watery than you imagined. Okay, fire folk. Like fire in nature, fire folk tend to be, that's really fun to say, actually, fire folk. Fire folk feels very fairyish. Quick for movement, energetic, dynamic, passionate, not only okay with change, but often seeking change. Often they're often the catalyst for the change around them. And in an unbalanced fire person, they can be pushy and overbearing, unpredictable, aggressive. Although I think you can be a fire and unpredictable and still be balanced, still be impetuous. So some of it comes from what's underneath it. Fire people can often be the most difficult of all the elements for other people because they are unpredictable and because they do shake things up a bit, and they tend to enjoy shaking things up a bit, and they're quite quick. That's also can be powerful. And I think without that changing nature, things can get stale. And people with fire element, they don't do well with that. But there is a difference between being energetic and dynamic and pushy and overbearing, and that would be the difference between a balanced fire person and not a balanced fire person.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think you can see the parallel there with fire in nature, in our environment. So, the sun helps things grow, and there's a real warmth and can be even comfort and a soothingness in the heat. And we can, we might enjoy a peaceful candle or be fascinated by the crackle of a campfire or something like that. But we also know that fire can be incredibly destructive. I think it again, it's helpful to think if you're feeling a bit stuck at any point in terms of, well, I'm not sure which am I most like, or which couple am I most like, or when you're, thinking about somebody else, think about, bring that back to, well, how does that element manifest in nature, which can help to guide you a bit, to, how that shows up in people.
Mm-hmm.
So probably our least tangible, our least dense element is air. Again, if we're thinking about the kind of nature aspect, there's the air around us, the wind, the sky, those are all part of the air element. And air can be very still, but wind has movement. And the difference between a very quiet, still day or a very windy day. And sometimes windy days can feel invigorating and enlivening, and sometimes they can just be overwhelming. And obviously, if they start tipping into hurricanes, then that's again the kind of destructive side. I think all these elements have a really positive and a potentially more destructive, or more dynamic in the middle, and then a more destructive kind of side to them. So an airy person, I should get you to describe this, Tiffany, given that that's your dominant kind of
That is very definitely my dominance.
Yeah, Tiffany had
Are you
no
serious? You
conflict or
actually
no
want me to?
upset about. No, I mean I can carry on if you prefer.
Please do. Please do. I want to hear how you think of airy people.
So when balanced, our airy friends are tend to be, very light, very open people. Much more. I was thinking about the change because we talked about, earthy people probably being least comfortable with change, might need more time to prepare, and watery people being quite fluid with change, and fiery people perhaps even seeking out change to liven things up. And I feel like I'm a little less sure. Maybe you can come in with this, Tiffany, about where an airy person would sit with change. I mean, certainly my experience of you is that you're quite comfortable with just a change at the last minute, or perhaps in some ways not so attached to a set plan,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
some of the other elements might prefer to have a bit more of a sense of knowing what's happening. Um,
I
so
think
I
that's one
think,
of the
sorry, go on.
I think the difference between an airy person and a fiery person is while we're both very comfortable with change, I don't know that airy people seek it, or I mean, if seek it in the sense that if things become too static, it becomes uncomfortable. But I think fiery people have much more opinions about what the change should be and the direction it should go in. Whereas an airy person and a watery
Right.
person, we kind of, don't really mind that much. Vanilla, chocolate, left, right, whatever it is, let's just not get too static. And I don't know that watery people are seeking change or uncomfortable with things being in a static state the way fire or air do. They're just comfortable with it in a way that earth isn't.
Mm. Yes, that's a really good distinction. So a watery person adapts well to change, but isn't so bothered if it doesn't happen. Whereas
Hmm.
fire and air would be more affected if it doesn't happen. And the fiery person is really seeking it, really wants it to happen. And the I guess that also links to, I can imagine an airy person as being the most likely to get bored of all the elements. Just kind of
You
like,
say
can we
that
do
like you
something
have
else
personal
now?
experience.
Like, my
Yeah.
lips are sealed. Um, yeah, so when out of balance, bored could be one adjective we might use there. But airy people can feel a bit flighty, a bit unreliable, the kind of ditzy sort of stereotype airhead. We even have a word to describe it. They can feel quite unstable or inconsistent, kind of not tethered to the here and now. And probably in that sense, the opposite extreme to an earthy person. An earthy person's really grounded, and an airy person is may not want to be very grounded. This certainly comes up for me a bit with healing sometimes, where we might need to help an earthy person lift up a little bit, and we might need to encourage an airy person to allow themselves to be a little bit more tethered, to find that place of balance. But there sometimes might be a bit of a reluctance with that, and more familiarity with where they would naturally tend to be. So airy people are probably the dreamers of the world, and can, I would say, also can respond quite quickly, but in a not in that sort of sharp instant way that a fiery person might. It's more of a flitting, perhaps, or we could do this or we could do that. And out of balance could become a bit unfocused, and sort of haphazard, but in focus could be, probably serve really well for new ideas and keeping energy lively, that kind of thing.
Hmm. There was something I just thought of for water that I wanted to add. That one of the
Mm.
characteristics of water is that they take up the shape of the container that they're in, right? Whatever container you put water into, it
Mm.
takes up that shape. And one of the ways that water is so adaptable is that watery people just sort of ooze into a situation and fill that shape up. And so and then they go into a different situation and they fill that space up in that way. And in a balanced state, that makes them very easy, very adaptable, and very lovely. But in an unbalanced state, watery people can sometimes lose who they are. What is their shape when they have no context? Who are they when they're not filling other
Yeah, I think
people's?
I think it can be hard to kind of keep your such a consistent boundary. But again, again, I think it's important to remember that you might not be 100% one or another. And I think, Tiffany, it would be fair to say of you, you're pretty dominantly airy, whereas I would say I was more water earth. So more of a, I don't know what the percentage would be, but I definitely have some of those earthy characteristics, but as we discussed, rather more water than I had realized. And I
Yes.
think, we have friends who are like really, really earthy and kind of they feel deep and like rocks and solid and immovable sometimes. And um, yeah, those kind of things. But it can be a fun thing to just think about the people and um, think, okay, how would I categorize them? And you might find some people are really easy to categorize, probably the ones that are more one of the elements predominantly, and then people who perhaps more of a mixture are likely to be harder.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It can be super helpful. I'm thinking of this one friend that Karen and I share in common, and this person is so earthy. Um, and I realized in speaking with them that I would often speak over them. If you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you may notice that I do that with Karen. I try hard not to, but it's hard. Um, and I actually took to when we would be having a conversation, I would actually count in my head the pause and give myself time and said, okay, if they're not going to speak by the time I get to 7, 8, or 9, then I will talk. And I can't tell you how many, actually, I think it was 10. I can't tell you how many times I would get to 7, 8, or 9 before they would speak again. And it
Mm.
really taught me a big lesson that my pace is a very airy pace, and theirs isn't. And if I wanted to be able to have more meaningful conversations, I needed to, in this case, I needed to match their pace.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and I think that's a big part of why we wanted to even discuss this as a topic, because I think it can help us understand ourselves better and and be more forgiving and tolerant of ourselves. I mean, I'm a big fan of, I think anything we can understand better about ourselves tends to help us be kinder towards ourselves. But if we can do it without judgment, but I think this particular topic is really one that can help relationships. Because if you find there's somebody that you keep conflicting with, it may be that just taking a minute to think, okay, well, how do they work? I mean, I know Tiffany and I have known each other a really long time. And one of the things that it really is of great value, I think, to both of us in our relationship is that we are able to sort of talk to each other if the other one is doing something that is annoying or, difficult. And I mean, it's certainly really helped me to, I think, be a better friend to Tiffany, understanding more about how she works in this way and how that's just different to me. And I think we really, really want to bring home with this topic that um, all the elements, when they're in balance, have great strengths and really contribute something that the other elements aren't as good at. Um, and all the elements, when out of balance, can be really difficult and annoying and irritating.
Yes, as people are when they're not balanced. I think it's similar to
Yeah.
understanding if the people in your life or you yourself are an introvert or an extrovert. I think it's in the same vein because
Mm.
once you have that understanding, you can adapt accordingly. You make allowances for yourself and for them. You can meet your own needs better. You can meet their needs better. Yeah. Another thing I'm aware of about the differences between is how decisions are made. For example, as a very airy person, I will often make a decision very, very quickly. but I don't always stick to it. Right? Sometimes for me, making a decision and telling myself I've made the decision and then living with that decision is almost part of the decision-making process before I've actually come to a true decision, right? So I may change my mind again and then live with that second decision for a little bit and see how that feels before I change my mind again into what the actual decision is. You can see how deeply annoying this might be to people who don't work this way, and who are waiting for my decisions, right? But then equally, I know people again who are watery or earthy. When they make the decisions, they takes a very, very long time from my perspective. And but when they do, it is solid and it is not changing and it is immovable, which can also be difficult for the people around them, right? You're not moving that person off their place. That person has put the time and the effort, and that's how they make decisions. And so mote it be. And it is what it is. You're not going to move them off. Where an airy person or a watery person, you give us the right argument, and you could probably change my mind with enough data and and enthusiasm. I'm not going to stick too hard to really anything.
Yeah, and I think you said a watery person, an airy person, but actually I'm wondering if it's more fire and air there, where there would be more changeability. Because it's
Yes.
interesting listening to you say that and thinking of my combination of earth and water. I mean, I think I do generally tend to think about things for a reasonable amount of time before I make a decision, and my decisions usually, once made, are fairly solid. But I think this is where my water can sometimes really balance out my earth quite nicely. Like the earth side of me makes me kind of considered, but the wateriness just gives me a little bit more flexibility. But compared to an airy or fiery person, I'm definitely much more taking a bit of time and being once decided, being more solid in it. But I think in us having this conversation, you can see that anyone who goes about things in a way that's kind of quite different to your way, if we're not understanding that well, I mean, that's where conflict is more likely to arise, because it can be difficult. I mean, I've had experiences earlier in our relationship, Tiffany, I know you know this, of feeling almost a bit bamboozled by your decision making. And then at some point, it suddenly occurred to me that she doesn't care if I say, can we do it differently? Like her quick, we're doing this, is not actually set in stone in the way it would be if I said that. And if I just say to her, I don't really want to do that, can we do something else? She's like, oh yeah, okay, no problem. And
Yeah. Yeah.
understanding that about how we make decisions, and being able to, and having this great relationship where we can have those conversations, and was just, I think it made such a difference to our relationship, because suddenly it freed both of us up to just be ourselves and know what we needed to be perhaps a bit careful of with the other, but more aware of, and make sure we got what we needed.
So the man that, yeah, you're absolutely right. And in that understanding, not only did it help us understand each other, be less affected by each other, but it gave us a shared vocabulary to talk about it. So the man that I'm married to is earthy. I'm sorry, watery. And one of the interesting things that happens there is most of the time he is adaptable, amenable, doesn't really care that much, whatever, we move, blah, 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 blah. But every once in a while, there is just this brick wall, what feels to me like a brick wall, especially in comparison to how kind of soft and watery he normally is. This brick wall of, I want that. I want it to be done this way, or I have this opinion. And that's when I'm become very aware that people who were watery are also waterfalls. Like Niagara Falls is a pretty intense amount of water that can move an amazing force when needed and required. And one single drip of water stream created the Grand Canyon. There's a relentlessness to people who are watery. that is, very gentle, but before you know it, I'm what? I'm just slowly dripping. I'm just slowly, and eventually you get the Grand Canyon, right? But then equally, there's just this of power behind the water every once in a while.
I feel like I'm just wondering if there's anything more we need to say about fiery people, because I feel like we've kind of talked about earth, water, and air a bit more, which, and I'm thinking that's probably because we feel most familiar with those because
Mm.
that's more us. But I was thinking about how sometimes people who, I mean, a fiery person, I mean, they're often the people who probably are responsible for things like social change and it takes some oomph and some decisive action to really make something happen in a big and radical way. And that can be an amazing and kind of awe-inspiring and a little bit scary sometimes thing to be around. And that kind of I would guess, I mean, again, it's a bit of a stereotype, but these things are stereotypes for a reason. That kind of, the fiery passionate person who, is very intense and has very strong feelings about things, that the other elements might tend to just not be quite so intense about in that same way. And the kind of, again, that out of balance can tip into um a sort of very angry or aggressive. But you also might see and I think this is something we perhaps see in our healing practices, fiery people who've been made to feel bad about their fieriness will often, clamp down their anger, but in doing so also clamp down their kind of passionate kind of side of their nature, because, other people might find that sometimes too much or socially unacceptable or whatever. And that can create whole loads of problems in itself. I mean, aside from being miserable, that can cause us real problems if we don't know how to deal with our anger. So it either gets sort of turned inwards, or it can become more problematic when it bursts out without
Mm-hmm.
control.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking while you were talking that I think even balanced fire people who are balanced can be scary, because there's so much passion and there's so much vision, and there's usually, I think, a very high moral code about what's right and what's wrong, and a lot of fire and willingness to go to the mattresses to make it happen. And I think because of the unpredictability of fire, the people around them don't know how far they're going to go, because they could do anything in the name of
Mm.
what it is that they believe in. You don't know, right? And a watery person, I think some of it's perhaps sad, but some of the comfort with watery people is that there's this imagined sense that what they're going to do when they're going to do it. They're never going to go too far, and you can kind of control them a little bit. You can kind of nudge them over and they'll move over for you. A fiery person is absolutely not doing that, which is part of why, to your
Mm.
point, Karen, they are glorious and fascinating and really needed, but not perhaps such an easy body to live in.
Mm. I feel like we should have had somebody more fiery on this episode to tell us more about what it's like to actually inhabit fire, from a kind of a more a personal point of view. Because I feel like there's ways we could with each of these types, if we're gonna, obviously, as with many categorization systems, it's a little bit oversimplified, because it's not really as discrete a categories as we're kind of talking about at the moment, just for the sake of sort of illustration. But I think there's aspects to each of the types that I feel I could really dig in and get into, saying how wonderful it was and celebrating it. But equally, I could really get into saying, God, that must be, either hard to be that or hard to be around that. So I, I don't know if we can really say one is harder to inhabit or harder to be around than another. And it probably depends a bit on how you are, which other types you're likely to find more or less difficult. Yeah, it would be interesting to have a more fiery person here to talk about that some more, but sadly we don't
It would
today. But
be.
perhaps that's a
It,
topic for another podcast.
yes, and well, and you make a good point, and you make a very good point in that by talking about these things in the way that we're talking about it, we're also revealing so much of our own personal experiences and so much of our own subjective experience, which is, as you say, is what it is, and absolutely slants it. But hopefully, it's enough that people can make use of it. I've had people say to me, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with exasperation, sometimes with awe, like, how do you get so much done? Because their perception is that it must be so hard, to your point about hard to inhabit a body. Like, how do you manage just being so this way, that way, all the time? And I'm like, I can't, I wouldn't want to be any other way. This is perfect for me, So I think to your point, what something looks like from the outside is very different than what it feels like on the inside. Hopefully we've given,
But I think there's also something there about kind of, again, getting to know ourselves and trying to do that in a way with as little judgment as we can manage, and really doing what we need to do to be as balanced as we can be, because it's perhaps easier to feel I wouldn't want to be any other way the more in balance you are, because out of balance life gets much more difficult, as it does. We did a whole podcast on being in balance, and this is one way that we can get out of balance. And I think for any of these types, if they're out of balance, life starts to get really difficult and not much fun, and you're probably not going to be feeling very good. So, or perhaps, finding it easy to be in your own body, or feel positively towards yourself. So there's something about, what do you need to do to help you get back into balance, to really support the strengths of the element of which you are dominant, or the element or two. And that might be things like, for me, as having that quite strong earth component, I know I can sometimes get a bit too heavy. So doing something to lighten myself up can be good. Or if I'm feeling a bit kind of insipid or, over watery, that might be when I might need to stop and say, what do I need right now? And actually do something for myself, rather than just keep going along with what everybody else is doing and being too appeasing. So I think that's another way that we can use this information to become more aware of what's happening within myself, and how might I best look after myself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, as well as using the information to help your relationships with other people. By identifying how other people are, you understand a lot more about what their needs are and what you can do to help them get back into balance themselves, or just not taking them personally. As Karen said about me, just not taking my airiness personally, and not only not taking it personally, being able to respect it as an asset and work with it with me. Right? You can do that for the people in your life that you care about. You can do it with your boss. The next time that your boss, if you understand your boss's character a little bit better in this realm, you will have more information about how to approach them, the timing of how to approach them, the language of having to approach somebody. All of these things are better. You will be more successful in these things if you approach somebody based on who they really are. Right? So you'll be able to help them when they're in need. You'll be able to recognize what they're going through. The people in my life, for example, if I'm doing routine things monotonously over and over and over again, the people in my life that know me know that I'm not doing well, right? Because that's not my nature, or things were going to go difficult for me, right? If an earthy person has to deal with things in their lives that are just coming at them so fast that they have no choice, that's a person that needs some help. right? So by understanding these things, and then again, how, if you're going to be raising a difficult question with somebody or asking them for something or wanting to share information with them, knowing how they'll receive it in the best way can be super helpful.
And I think maybe one point to end on is this is a way of understanding people that for me has really helped me enjoy people more, the people in my life. It not only helps when things are more difficult, when somebody's struggling, or when the communication between two people is difficult, but it really makes me value and enjoy the lovely characteristics that people can have when they're, when you see your partner or your friend or even your boss or whoever, who really in more balance and really in those good parts of the element, good aspects. It's a joy, even if it's really different, and it's lovely that to you, and it's really lovely that there are people in the world who can get that wildly passionate about things. There is wonderful that people can be so spontaneous. It's wonderful that people can be so calm and still and deep, and it's wonderful that people can be so fluid and adaptable, and we can really enjoy those parts of people rather than getting a bit stuck in the ways that it can be more difficult.
Yeah, see, isn't she lovely? She's all watery right now. So hopefully we've given you a model, a conceptual idea about how to match the characteristics that you have and the people around you have, and how the natural world can teach us about ourselves and those things. And you can use that information to take better care of yourself, to make your relationships better, a little bit easier. And as Karen just said, to enjoy things a little bit more and understand them, that it's happening because it's who they are, and be able to enjoy them better. And hopefully you've understood that each of the elements, I don't know, as Karen said, how great of a job that we did covering all of the elements equally, but hopefully we've done a good enough job that you can see that there is great strength in all of them when they're imbalanced. And there is great strength in knowing when those elements are unbalanced, so that we can use that information to help ourselves out a little bit and make our lives a little bit easier.
Thank you very much for listening today. It's been great to have you with us, and we do hope you'll join us next time.
Bye, everybody.
Hi, I'm Carol Smith, the producer of the Life Made Easier podcast. We hope today's episode gave you some meaningful tools and takeaways to help make your life feel a little lighter. You've reached the end of this episode, but not the end of the ways that you can support us. Please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, follow us on social media, and check out our Patreon for extra content and ways you can go deeper with us. There's also a whole library of episodes waiting for you to help increase your energy intelligence. Take care, and we'll see you on the next Life Made Easier.